The Trump administration is working to get a handle on both the health and economic fronts of the coronavirus pandemic. Skylar Henry begins our coverage with the latest from the White House.
With Hurricane Isaias battering Puerto Rico, President Trump headed to Florida to discuss how to deal with the approaching storm in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic.
We're doing a good job on that. We have vaccines that are really getting close. We have therapeutics that are really getting close.
Earlier in the day, President Trump tweeted his criticism of Democrats for questioning America's coronavirus testing capabilities, even as his testing czar acknowledged real problems with the system.
Would it be possible for our nation to have results for all COVID tests completed and returned within 48 and 72 hours?
It is not a possible benchmark we can achieve today, given the demand and the supply.
At the same hearing Friday, Congressman Jim Jordan pushed Dr. Anthony Fauci to say protests should be shut down after the infectious disease expert said crowds help spread the virus.
I said crowds. I didn't say specifically. I didn't say protests do anything.
So the protests don't increase the spread of the virus?
I didn't say that. You're putting words in my mouth.
Fighting between the White House and Congress has so far prevented a deal on a new coronavirus relief package.
It is a disgrace that they're not negotiating, but they're only looking to play a political game. I happen to think it's a bad political game. I think it hurts them.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says it's not a game.
We want to help America's working families, and they want to give tax cuts to the richest people. Why can't they come to agreement? We don't have shared values. That's just the way it is. So it's not bickering. It's standing our ground.
Millions of Americans on unemployment are losing their extra $600 a week in federal benefits as of today. Skylar Henry, CBS News, the White House.
Nancy Cordes and Zeke Miller join me now. Nancy is CBS News chief congressional correspondent, and Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. Welcome, Nancy and Zeke. On these negotiations over coronavirus relief, Zeke, can you break down the proposals from Democrats and Republicans? What are the priorities on each side?
Well, Democrats are looking for a very large bill that will provide some of these direct assistance to Americans, but they want to couple that with things like improvements in federal support for testing, like we just heard, additional federal funding, a lot more federal funding for schools, as well as funding for state and local governments who've seen their budgets crushed by reduced tax revenues over the course of the pandemic and the subsequent economic collapse. Republicans aren't so keen on the public aid support, but they along with the president, have said they would like to get this assistance into the pockets of everyday Americans. But Mitch McConnell and Republicans would like to see liability protections for businesses and schools that reopen. So there's a lot of sticking points there, but and not a whole lot of momentum, it seems, right now.
Well, Nancy, White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows says that during negotiations late Thursday that he offered various proposals on short-term benefits. What can you tell us about that, Nancy?
Well, he actually made a couple of proposals. The first one was to extend the $600 unemployment benefits for 1 week. And Democrats pretty swiftly rejected that. They said there's no point in extending them for a week. The two sides are still so far apart on so many of the issues that Zeke just outlined. 1 week really isn't going to be enough to bridge that gap. And then he came back and offered a second proposal, this time 4 months worth of unemployment benefits, but at a reduced rate, $400 a week instead of $600 a week, like we have right now. And then he threw a couple of other things in there, I'm told, about $105 billion for school funding, and also the liability protections that are very important to Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. And Democrats rejected that too. Because while it would have extended these unemployment benefits for 4 months, they felt that a package like that, a skinny proposal, as they've dubbed it, would enable Republicans to essentially sort of wipe their hands and walk away and not come back to negotiate over all the other things that are in their $3 trillion rescue package that are also very important to them. Things like funding for state and local governments and funding for testing. And so they still believe believe that the best approach is to negotiate about all the different spending issues that are in front of the House and the Senate, even if that means apparently a short-term lapse in unemployment benefits and really sort of putting 30 million people in this country in limbo, not knowing whether and when they're going to get that additional money.
Right, Nancy, so given that state of limbo, when can we expect both sides to actually resume negotiations?
They're still talking. Speaker Pelosi and White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows were scheduled to get on a call today. We believe they're meeting in person tomorrow. But they've both said that they are quite far apart. And so the bad news for anyone who was receiving that $600 federal benefit is there's really no telling when they are going to get the money again, and if and when they do, whether it will be retroactive and whether they'll be able to get essentially back pay for the weeks that are missed. The leaders of the House, in an attempt to kind of pressure the two sides into trying to hammer out a negotiation, essentially called off the August recess today, basically told lawmakers that even if they go home, they might have to come back to vote. But whether or not that's going to be enough to bridge the divide here when the Republican and Democratic proposals are so different still remains to be seen.
So, Zeke, despite the divides, both sides are united in their opposition to money requested by the Trump administration for a new FBI building. Have we heard anything from the president and his team regarding that criticism?
Well, we heard from Kayleigh McEnany, the White House press secretary, early Friday, essentially defending the introduction of these sort of extraneous measures or funding priorities into these bills. These were included in the draft Republican legislation released this week, and both parties really have said they want no part of it because they were essentially politically untenable to sort of throw more than $1 billion for new FBI headquarters in Washington, and then also nearly $400 million for renovation of the West Wing and the White House complex at a time when so many Americans are out of work and feeling the pain. It struck many of them as tone deaf. The White House says, well, this legislation, previous rounds of legislation included all sorts of other extraneous elements in there as well, but the problem is the White House doesn't really have a vote here. The president gets to sign the bills. He doesn't get to draw them up, and it seems there's not a whole lot of appetite on the part of lawmakers to keep these provisions in the bill long term.
Right. I think a lot of Americans would be wondering about that, as you note, with so many out of work. Nancy, as we heard in Skylar's piece, Dr. Anthony Fauci testified before a House panel Friday on the nation's coronavirus response. What were some of the key takeaways from that?
Well, one of the main takeaways was that Dr. Fauci said that he feels fairly confident that the U.S. will have a working vaccine by the end of this year and going into early next year. So a lot of lawmakers thought that was very good news. He did say that when it comes to administering the vaccine, that it would be doled out in phases, so all Americans wouldn't be able to get it right away. But the fact that he still feels confident that perhaps by the end of the fall semester, which is a big concern for a lot of parents, that this vaccine might be available to some Americans, that was very welcome news for a lot of the lawmakers today.
Meantime, Zeke, President Trump took part in a COVID-19 roundtable in Florida, and Florida is one of the many states still reporting daily increases in cases and deaths. Did the president offer any solutions on curbing the outbreak there or nationwide?
Not particularly. The president has sort of been leaving, continuing the posture has been sort of adopted throughout the course of this crisis, sort of leaving the nuts and bolts of the crisis response to governors, and then also separately the White House Coronavirus Task Force, which is led by the vice president. He's talked about things like surging supplies and testing supplies and federal personnel to some of those states like Florida that have been at the epicenter of the growth in the outbreak over the last several weeks now. But no real specifics, and that sort of has always been the disconnect here. The way the president has approached this crisis, whether now that Florida's in the hot seat, but before when it was Arizona, and then months ago when it was states like New York and New Jersey, the president essentially sort of taken a very hands-off approach, leaving the nuts and bolts of the response over to those governors, and that's not what what state and local officials have been calling for months. They've been asking for national strategies for testing, national strategies for virus response, and lawmakers on Capitol Hill and both parties have been calling for the same there as well. But the president has been pretty adamant that sort of his view of how this should be run. So he's not, by and large, offered a whole lot of guidance to these states as they've seen these flare-ups, as he calls them.
All right, Nancy Cordes and Zeke Miller for us. Always so valuable to have your reporting and insight. Thanks to you both.
You're welcome.
Thanks.